Hello, and welcome to the final installment of Carl Schmitt's Land and Sea. We're going to be looking here again at his theory of a spatial revolution. So in the last section, we looked at the transitions from sea powers from medieval to modern sea powers, and in this section, we're going to be looking at the consequences of the kind of total supremacy of sea powers, which emerged through, well, England and then later America. And we're going to be looking at the consequences of the circumnavigation of the world. And ultimately the spatial revolution that we're in now, which we eventually, move from sea powers to machine powers, the invention of airplanes, planes that can fly, around the world, and how fast can a jet, military grade, fighting jet, how fast can that spin around the globe? I don't know. It's probably like a few hours the most or something. Like, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Google it, but it's pretty fast. So then you have that, and then you later have the kind of communication revolution of instantaneous communication technologies, which Schmitt was writing about, I suppose. I mean, in his day, he was really talking about kind of radio would be like the most kind of high speed kind of communication technology, but you know, but like now it's just the internet, right? It's just ridiculous. So yeah, okay. So let's get started. So we'll begin with the terrestrial globalization, and the whole world becomes circumnavigated. We have the revolution of Copernicus, the discovery that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that the Earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. So this creates a kind of spatial crisis as well, because it basically means that space is just vast, indefinite, open sort of indefinite. It changes the ontology basically of the universe. The discovery was obviously consequential, and we know that there was a lot of kind of persecution of people the scientists that were arguing that this was the case. And now there was a reason there was persecution, because this had consequences. This discovery that the Earth is not the center, and the sun and moon and so on move around the Earth. Well, maybe the moon does, but the sun moves around the Earth. This has a lot of kind of consequences for how we understand humans within the ontological our ontological place within the universe and the universe itself. So Schmitt says that now the Earth, until then so fixed, moved around the sun, but even this was not yet the deepest actual spatial alteration that from now on entered. The expansion of the cosmos and the conception of an infinite empty space were decisive. So yeah, I recommend also reading Peter Sloterdijk's books, Spheres trilogy, where he basically does go into this. He speculates on the effect of this turn, and of the effect of the kind of consequences of infinite space, of existing within infinite space instead of existing within a kind of contained universe where there's sort of celestial realms, which is what all the ancients believed. Like if you go back to Aristotle's speculations on the universe and the heavens and the celestial realms, it was basically like the Earth was this kind of center core, and then you had different levels of kind of celestial existences. You had the heavens, you would kind of stars, and then you put it beyond that, something else. This gets completely switched into nope, it's just infinite space out there, right? And one can you kind of have to sit down and think about the effects of that nowadays, because we don't really kind of take that for granted. We've always lived in the modern world with that understanding. So, but if you put yourself in the position of someone who believed that there was a kind of kind of concentric, a set of concentric rings which existed, which contained the universe, it contained the earth, and contained human existence within the center of the universe, and then that completely changes. So Schmitt really in this section wants to understand the emergence of European expansion into all of these other parts of the world. And like, there is this question he brings up, which is that, like, why, would it have been fair to assume that if the Europeans didn't find America or Australia, that the natives would have eventually found Europe? Like, they would be the ones coming over to. And I think Schmidt's answer would be no. Like something happened already, prior to. I mean, and obviously, the effects of what he basically calls Occidental rationalism. I think. Something had already occurred, not just the invention of seafaring technologies, which made it possible, and navigation and so on, which made it practically possible to travel all the way to America. Because, as Schmitt brings up, the Vikings went to America. I mean, I don't think they really did much there. They just kind of found it and we went there for a little bit, and then we're like, this is kind of a strange place. Let's go back. This is probably all they did. But we know of prior to Columbus, basically, and these discoverers, that there were excursions to places like America that like, on a practical level, it wasn't impossible to travel that far. It was pretty much more dangerous and much more precarious, but it wasn't completely impossible. And I'm pretty sure actually they discovered like somewhere in the Pacific, down by like New Zealand and all that kind of area, that there were tribes which had very small boats of some sort or another, and nothing compared to the kind of large sailing vessels that the Europeans had in the in the 16th century, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and they made these incredibly distant journeys and could navigate actually pretty well using, I think, the stars and so on. So like, on a practical level, it's actually not like the founding of America and the Age of Discovery was completely new. It shouldn't be treated as merely a sort of technological event. It should be treated also as an expression of what he calls Occidental rationalism. Yeah, so Schmitt will say, the discovery of new continents and the circumnavigation of the earth are only manifestations and consequences of transformations that lie deeper. And he mentions the fact that Vikings, for example, discovered America before Columbus. And basically what he's saying here is that it was only with this era of Columbus and these other discoverers that we can properly call this traveling, call this discovery a spatial revolution, to embody it as a part of a spatial revolution, not just a kind of happenstance or a kind of accidental discovery by a few people. So Schmitt kind of defines this difference, and he says there's more to a spatial revolution than landing in a heretofore unknown place. A spatial revolution involves a change in the concepts of space, encompassing all levels and domains of human existence. So when we're talking about a spatial revolution, we're talking about a radical change which affects all levels of human existence. It's not just a practical discovery. So then, just to go a bit more into this Occidental rationalism, what happens according to Schmitt at this time is a sort of Occidental rationalism bursts out, and it spreads all around the world. It just like, colonizes basically everywhere in the world, or everywhere that it can. It's a time of huge expansion and huge transformation of the world, and a huge change in the way we understand the world. In Schmidt's terms, in particular, spatially, but we could, the spatial revolution affects everything else. So he says, Occidental rationalism now advances irresistibly. It develops into the Western and Central European peoples, destroys the medieval forms of human community, and builds new states, fleets, and armies, invents new machines, subjugates the non-European peoples, and places them before the dilemma of either adopting European civilization or of descending to the status of mere colonial people. So, this new order is basically what Schmitt refers to here as the nomos. I'll probably do a breakdown of nomos of the earth as well. I just need to actually read that properly in detail first. But the there's someone. It's peculiar to read this actually, just as a side note, because Schmidt's kind of labeled this Nazi sympathizing, European, you know, uh, you know, Nazi sympathizing European philosopher. But like a lot of this section could be read as could be read in a very like as a critique of European colonization. Which is interesting. He even mentions in another section that it never even struck the Europeans at the time to think that what they discover may not belong to them, right? They just assumed whatever they find is theirs, and they have a kind of divine right to it, nearly. They didn't really take into account that there's probably been people there for thousands and thousands of years, and so on and so forth. He doesn't come across in any of this like kind of like a moralistic, critical theorist or something. But there is definitely a surprising tone which this takes in this section, which is interesting. So basically, we go into the section on land appropriation and the expansion of these European powers into these newly founded continents like America, Australia, and so on. It leads to a disturbance in the nomos, because it leads to, well, first of all, it leads to a newly found distinction between kind of civilized and uncivilized people. I mean, if you think about this, right? If you think about like Europe as a civilization, it suddenly finds like it's quite advanced in its rationalism and in its technological capacity, and it's also already going through a kind of breakup with the medieval period, and there's a rationalism, right? There's an advance in rationalism, and there's a move away from the kind of mysticism and so forth, which is common to the medieval period. And you find a bunch of these like really, basically tribes like living in like pure hunter-gatherer situations. This would lead to a change in the kind of self-consciousness and self-identification of Europeans, because it's like, look how kind of backwards these people are in some sense. Look how, and I don't mean the backward in like a moral sense, but look how sort of they haven't really done anything. Like they're still in this hunter-gatherer phase. It would lead to a pretty radical change in how we understand ourselves as European people, right? And this leads to an enforcement of a kind of civilized, uncivilized civilized, uncivilized distinction, which we shouldn't be foolish enough to think that that would end just with Europeans versus tribal hunter-gatherer type peoples, Aboriginals in Australia and in natives in America. I mean, this civilized uncivilized distinction then starts to come home to roost, and you see all sorts of changes in the kind of more domestic European order start to emerge, which is exactly what happened. But anyway, maybe I'll get into that a bit later. But so you have this, you have a expansion of kind of a rational Occidental order into all these parts of the world, and then you have these brutal conflicts between, for example, the Spanish and the French, the Portuguese and the English, the English and the French, Spanish and the French, whatever. You've all these pretty brutal contests, fighting over these newly discovered lands and fighting over how this will be appropriated, and it's very difficult to mediate any of these conflicts because the local orders which are there, in mainland Europe, don't exist if you're in America or Australia or wherever. Um, these orders don't really exist. Like the Pope, the Church, kings, and so forth can't control what happens and can't mediate conflicts. So you sort of have an explosion in nationalism as well, because um, you have French versus English or Spanish versus French. Um, um, uh, Peoples, in these new lands, in these newly discovered lands, fighting over them, and uh, that's going to lead to that's going to lead to an intensification of kind of national identity and hostility towards other European identities, because suddenly you're in this part of the world and it's kind of a free for all, and it's kind of take whatever you get, and there's going to be no authority. There's going to be not much authority. It's really going to be trying to de-escalate or mediate these contesting claims over this new land. So it leads to a pretty brutal, kind of civil war type maybe scenario within Europe as well, which we're going to get into later. Then you have the worsening of this, because you have, at least when Catholic powers are fighting over lands far away, you could at least have the Church or the Pope influencing some sort of juristic mediation between the two. But then when you have the Protestant Catholic split, you no longer even have that option. So you don't just have different nationalities fighting over these new lands with each other. You also have Catholics and Protestants fighting with each other over these new lands. And I think that you could really view Protestantism, actually. I think Schmitt would probably. I think he kind of implies this in his book, that Protestantism really is also the product of an expansion away from mainland Europe into these other parts of the world. Um, Insofar that Europe was kind of bound by a religion and a church and a kind of a religious order, it was kind of harmonized together or bound together through that order. And then you see this split in the church, and you also see a split in geographically between the expanded people and between the people in domestic mainland Europe. So you have this new nomos basically developing within this period. A move away from medieval thinking, medieval communities, medieval philosophy, and so forth. Kind of break out of rationalism. Um, a juristic and kind of legal crisis over how you settle conflicts, because you can't settle them in the same way that you can in mainland Europe when there's basically no mediating authority. Um, in these newly discovered continents, and you start to see these people from these continents start to see themselves as independent from and distinct from the authorities of mainland Europe. And Schmitt will then say that you can understand the 30 Years' War in Germany as basically the importing of an external conflict between land appropriating powers. So, without getting into too much detail about all of the different schisms between, the Jesuits and the Calvinists and the Catholics and blah, 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 Schmitt will say that the consequence was that Germany became a battlefield of an overseas war of land appropriation, internally foreign to itself, without itself partaking in the land appropriation. So, because it's interesting, from a German perspective, obviously, that Schmitt being German, there's this interesting, aspect of this, which was that Germany didn't really participate very much in this land appropriation. They didn't really get their share of the new spoils of this expansion, compared to France, England, Spain in particular. So we also have to think of the time period Schmitt was writing this in, which was obviously after World War One. And Germany had their colonies, the only colonies they really had. I think there was a few colonies in Africa or somewhere. They had these taken from them, and there was also, I think, I'm not sure exactly the specifics of the time Schmitt was writing in, but today mainland Germany, is a lot smaller than it was at one stage prior to World War II and so forth. So Germany, to look at this from a German perspective, I think would be interesting, because you have these land appropriations and you have these contests and you have this massive wealth creation by all these Western European superpowers, except really for Germany. But then all of a sudden, the divisions which the contest over these land appropriations causes comes home to roost, most violently in Germany itself, right? This causes this massive 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics. So you have a kind of European civil war in which basically Germany endured the worst negative aspects of, and simultaneously profited the least from, right? So this is an interesting perspective, and I do think that kind of European civil war, however you want to parse it, Catholic, Protestant, land, sea, and so forth, really did in the early 20th century come home to roost. Not just in the 30 Years' War, but in the 20th century came home to roost very badly in Germany as well. And Germany really suffered for this because of the civil war, without profiting from it very much over and over again. I think you can kind of understand German history actually a lot better thinking about it in these terms. I also wanted to compare this to Northern Ireland, because Ireland was a country that didn't participate in this colonial expansion. A lot of people emigrated to America, for example, but this wasn't the colonial expansion. This was just there was a big famine and people just went. But then Northern Ireland basically became another battleground for this European civil war between Catholics and Protestants. So again, a country that didn't really profit from it very much, but did endure a lot of the hardships of these European divisions. So that's just an interesting comparison. Schmitt will kind of wrap up the book in the final few pages by just kind of going over again this land sea split, and he'll make some observations which I think have become more acknowledged and more common nowadays. Whereas he'll say, land war is basically I'll just read the quote actually. Land war: the states of the European continent have constructed certain forms since the 16th century, at the basis of which lies the thought that war is a relation between the state and state. On both sides, there is a state organized military power, and the armies carry out battle among one another on the open battlefield. Only the fighting hosts confront one another as enemies, while the non fighting civilian population remains outside the hostilities. Civilian population is not an enemy and shall not be treated as an enemy, so long as it does not partake in battle. For sea war, on the contrary, at its basis lies the thought that trade and economy of the enemy ought to be targeted. The enemy in such a war is not only the fighting opponent, but also every member of the enemy state, and finally also the neutral party conducting trade with the enemy, who stands in an economic relation with the enemy. So you basically, have this reinforcement of a distinction. Land war is the combat between two kind of official, observable military powers in an open battle, and sea war involves this targeting of the economy and of the civilian population. It sees everyone as part of that population. I think a really good example of this is drone strikes or something like this, or economic sanctions and so forth, which have devastating consequences for people when there's like starvation and so on. Think of Iraq during the Gulf War and so on and so forth. So, you have this reinforcement of a distinction there, and Schmitt will basically then speak of England's rise to being this kind of supreme, prior to the Americans, supreme naval sea power. And he'll reference Disraeli, who was I think was a prime minister, one of the English prime ministers, who claimed that England was an Asian superpower and not a European one. And Schmitt will basically sort of analyze the splitting off of England from the continent. That he will claim that it's always been an island in the kind of geographic sense, but it only became a kind of separate entity in the more political sense, in the more civilizational sense, during when it emerged as this kind of naval superpower, and its destiny, was as a naval power in the ocean, and it became this, it became something which is sort of distinct from Europe in a sense. And I think maybe you could understand America in that sense as the next step of this breaking off, not just geographically, but kind of civilizationally and politically and so forth. And he'll even mention something about how the word continental, at least it's not so much nowadays, but at the time that Schmitt was writing this, he says that the word continental kind of acquired a connotation of being backward. So when I said earlier that, you have an expansion of kind of Occidental rationalism into the rest of the world, and you meet these very primitive people in these hunter-gatherer situations, and it kind of really reinforces a civilization and a civilized and uncivilized schism. You then get that coming home to roost in Europe, because you get like continental people being referred to as backwards, and backwards, of course, is kind of a more moderate way of saying you're a barbarian or something. It's a kind of more polite way of saying you're a barbarian. You're kind of a quasi-barbarian. You're on your way to being a barbarian. If you don't get in line, in the next few years, you might be a barbarian. So, and I think again, this again rings quite true today, because, the most aggressive expressions of like political correctness, or like, accusing people of being backward and primitive and blah, 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 always seem to come from the Anglosphere. It always seems to come primarily from the Anglosphere. The French have a little bit of this too. They like to label certain people, oh, barbarian, whatever. But I think the most assertive and aggressive accusations of barbarism generally do come from the Anglosphere. So this rings true again today. And I think that if you look at, for example, political correctness, for example, certain attempts to liberalize parts of the world that really don't want to be liberalized, and all sorts of accusations which emerge from this, and kind of distinctions between the civilized people and the enlightened people and the backward people do generally come primarily from the English speaking world. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good observation on Schmidt's part. So next he will discuss the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, and then later the Crimean War, really marked the supremacy of sea power over land power in the 19th century. The 19th century really could be understood in these terms of the victory of sea power over land powers, both with the loss of Napoleon in Waterloo and then with the defeat of the Russians in Crimea. So, because Napoleon's military, I mean, France is a little bit of sea power and a little bit of land power. It's a bit of both, but I definitely think Napoleon was really an expression of land power, and of course, no one could really beat him on land. But he couldn't take England because England had too good of a navy, so there was this kind of standoff, blah 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 blah, and eventually he did lose. But you have the emergence and victory of sea powers, and then Schmitt will discuss England as moving from a fish to a machine. So we kind of continue these zoological references. In the 19th century, compared to the 18th, 17th centuries, England will lose its kind of marine vitality, its kind of hardy seafaring spirit, and it will become this kind of industrial machine managing society, which I do think kind of rings true a little bit. If you think about Victorian morality, was very much a kind of time where that kind of seafaring hardy spirit was suddenly seen as lesser and crass and vulgar, and we can't have this, blah blah blah. But anyway, you have this emergence then of more advanced industrial capacities, primarily in England first, and we see the element of the air being introduced finally. So you have land, sea, and you eventually have the element of air being introduced. We see the introduction of space-destroying technologies, and this is very okay. So I know for sure Aurelio wasn't reading Schmitt and not saying anything because maybe it's politically incorrect or something, because Schmitt was supposed to be associated with the Nazis, blah blah blah. But we see, through flight, through planes, and then through what in Schmitt's time would have just been like radio technology, but now is constant instantaneous communication through the internet and so forth. We have this emergence of air finally emerging through technology, and this of course causes another massive spatial disturbance and spatial revolution, because it literally destroys space, right? Read Virilio, he's quite good on this. So Schmitt ends just with a little definition of the importance of space and spatial revolutions, and he says, "Today, by space, we no longer understand a mere dimension of depth, empty of every conceivable content. For us, space has become a force field of human energy, activity, and achievement. Today, a thought first becomes possible for us that would have been impossible in any other epoch, and which a contemporary German philosopher has articulated. The world is not in space, rather space is in the world." And there he's quoting none other than Martin Heidegger.